The vicar's voice had carried the ceremony to within 3 words of its close, when Eleanor Bassett did the thing that no one in the church would ever forget. She turned to the man beside her and said, quietly and without apology, "Remove your glove." The organ had not yet begun. The candles along the nave held still. Some 40 guests arranged in the old stone pews of St. Clement's, Deverage, sat in the specific suspended silence of people who had heard correctly, but could not yet believe what they had heard. The Earl of Deverage, Richard Vane, 34 years old, and possessed of an authority so settled it rarely required expression, did not move. His face was the color of winter sky. His right hand, gloved in white kid, while the left remained bare, rested at his side with a stillness that was not composure, but something older than composure, something closer to endurance. "Miss Bassett," the vicar said, his voice gentle and alarmed in equal measure. Eleanor did not look at the vicar. She looked at the Earl's hand. She had noticed it the moment she reached the altar and took her place beside him, had noticed the slight difference in weight between the 2 gloves, the way his right hand held itself apart from the rest of his body, as though he had long since learned to regard it as separate. She had told herself she was imagining. She had tried to attend to the ceremony. She had tried to hear the Latin and the English, and the familiar shapes of the vows she had rehearsed with her father in the parsonage at Ashwick 6 years ago, and in another life entirely. The hand had remained at the edge of her vision, and with it came a memory she had spent 5 years filing carefully away into a part of herself she did not examine in public. There was a man. There had been a man in the summer of 1812 who had arrived at the Ashwick parsonage on a hired horse, his right hand wrapped in linen, his face worn with 3 days of hard riding and a wound he had not tended properly. He had told her father he was Mr. Vane, a gentleman from the north, and could they assist him? They had assisted him. Eleanor, then 17, had changed his dressings in the parsonage kitchen for 4 mornings, had listened to him speak about his brother and about an accident in a field outside Durham, and had read to him from her father's bookshelves when the infection rose and he could not leave. He had not told her his full name or his title. She had not pressed him. She had pressed the dressings against the wound on his right hand, a long diagonal burn from a kicked lantern at a stable fire, and she had learned the exact shape of it, the way you learn the geography of a country you visit only once. He had left on a Tuesday morning, recovered and courteous, and closed. She had thought about him for longer than was sensible. She looked at the Earl's right hand and thought, "It is him." "My lord," she said. Her voice was steady because she had no other voice available to her. "Before I speak these vows, I would ask you to show me your right hand." The silence in St. Clement's was absolute. Lady Constance Osgood, seated in the first pew on the groom's side, her fan held at its precise and warning angle, had gone very still. Miss Lavinia Hartworth, arranged 1 row back in a gown the color of frost, looked as though she had swallowed something she could not name. The Earl of Deverage looked at her for the first time since she had arrived at the altar, and stood beside him. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, and his eyes were the gray of a sky before weather. And whatever he saw in her face arranged itself inside him like a key finding a lock in the dark. He reached up with his left hand and drew the white glove from his right. The scar ran from the base of his thumb to the 3rd knuckle, a diagonal line silver with age, exactly as she remembered it. Nobody in the church spoke. Eleanor turned back to the vicar. Her voice did not tremble. "Please continue," she said. She had known him after all. She had not known, standing in that parsonage kitchen in her oldest apron with the kettle on and her father's copy of Cowper open on the table, that the man whose hand she tended would one day stand beside her at an altar, and that the hand would be the only proof she trusted. She had not known when her uncle Mr. Addison had summoned her to his study in the January of this year and informed her that her debts, her father's debts, her future, had all been arranged by a gentleman of title and property named Vane, that the name would produce a catch beneath her ribs rather than dread. She had not known, in truth, until she stood at the altar and saw the glove, that she had been waiting all along for exactly this confirmation. She was 23 years old, the youngest daughter of the late Reverend Bassett of Ashwick, and she had been poor for 2 years. This was not the kind of poverty that operated at a polite distance. Her father had died in the spring of 1815, leaving a parsonage that reverted to the living, a library that was sold in November, and a small sum that dissolved before the year was out. She had gone to her uncle in December, not from preference but from necessity. And her uncle, a man whose kindness was always contingent, had accepted her on the understanding that she would be no trouble and that her situation would be resolved as expediently as possible. The resolution he had arranged was a betrothal to the Earl of Deverage, whose estate adjoined the county, and whose reasons for accepting the arrangement Eleanor had never been able to determine. She had met him once before the ceremony, at a formal dinner at her uncle's house in February. The room had been candle-lit and full, and the introductions brief. She had seen a tall man with dark hair and an expression that offered nothing. He had bowed. She had curtsied. She had sat 12 places from him at the table and heard his voice carry precisely once a single level sentence addressed to her uncle, and then no more. She had not connected him to the man from Ashwick. She had been too frightened of the circumstances to look closely at anything. Lady Constance Osgood had been present at that dinner. Lady Osgood was the widow of the Earl's maternal uncle, a woman of considerable social authority and a certainty about her own position that she wore as other women wore jewelry, constantly, and as a matter of course. She had arranged herself at the table's most visible point and received guests with a graciousness that had precision in it rather than warmth. When she had been introduced to Eleanor, she had looked at her, from the borrowed silk of her bodice to the twice-mended hem of her gown, and her expression had shifted in a way that was not perceptible to anyone standing more than 3 feet away. "The vicar's pauper," she had murmured to her son Percy, who stood at her left elbow with a glass of wine and an expression of faint entertainment, "will not embarrass us long." Percy Osgood had laughed, briefly and through his nose, and Eleanor had heard every word of it from 3 feet away. She had smoothed the mended hem of her gown with one careful hand, and said nothing, because she had learned, in her uncle's house, that saying nothing was often the thing that cost least. She had stood at that dinner, and understood that the Earl's household considered this marriage a temporary inconvenience. She had understood that she was not expected to last. She had understood this, and had gone home and sat in her small cold room, and told herself that she would endure it gracefully, because that was the only kind of endurance available to her. She had not, at that point, yet seen the glove. The ceremony was concluded. They were married. The Earl of Deverage handed her into the carriage himself, without ceremony, with only a brief instruction to the footman to close the door. He sat across from her in the cold gray light of the March morning and looked out the window as the horses moved. The scar on his right hand was visible now, resting against his knee. Eleanor watched it without watching it. The way you learn to regard a fire whose heat you feel, but whose light you need not look at directly. After several minutes, he said, "You recognized it." "Yes," she said. He said nothing further. Nor did she. The carriage moved through the Deverage lanes, bare and gray-brown with the end of winter, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, and did not yet try to name the thing that had taken up residence in her chest. The estate was large and quiet in the way of places that have been managed well for a very long time. Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, met them at the door with the warm formality of a woman who had been at Deveridge for 30 years and regarded the house as her particular responsibility. She was stout and deliberate, and looked at Eleanor with an expression of careful assessment that was not unkind, and she showed her to the morning room and had tea brought before anyone asked for it. The Earl did not come to dinner that first evening. A footman brought his apologies. Eleanor sat alone at one end of a table that could seat 20 and ate her soup and read the letter her uncle had sent by messenger that afternoon, informing her that the business of the estate would require her cooperation in certain social engagements arranged for the coming weeks, and that she was to conduct herself in a manner befitting her new station. She put the letter down beside her bread plate and looked at the painting above the fireplace, a landscape of the Deveridge grounds in summer, green and open and lit by a sun that seemed to come from directly above. She was a countess now. The season had not decided whether to find this amusing or offensive. Lady Osgood arrived on Thursday. She came with a maid and a portmanteau, and an expectation of the West suite that she communicated to Mrs. Peel before she had removed her traveling coat. She came also with Miss Lavinia Hartworth, who arrived in a separate carriage and whose visit was presented to Eleanor as a neighborly courtesy, a young woman with family connections in the county, who had been kind enough to accompany Lady Osgood on the road from London. Miss Hartworth was everything the season had decided to approve of, dark-haired and polished, and possessed of a smile that landed at precisely the right moment and stayed exactly the right number of seconds. She sat in the drawing-room with her hands folded and her gown unwrinkled, and conversed with the Earl about mutual acquaintances with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the conversation so many times it had become natural. Eleanor sat near the window and listened, and said very little, because the conversation had not required her, and she was still learning the rooms. "You must forgive the arrangements," Lady Osgood said to Miss Hartworth, on the second afternoon, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough. "A hasty marriage so seldom has time to be properly managed. Though I dare say the vicar's pauper will find her footing eventually." Miss Hartworth's gaze slid sideways to Eleanor and then away again, with the speed of someone who has been trained not to show that they have heard something they were not supposed to hear. Eleanor set down her needlework and picked it up again, and said nothing. The Earl was not present at these teas. He was present at dinners, seated at the head of the table, and at the occasional evening gathering in the drawing-room. But he did not seek out Eleanor's company in any deliberate way, and he did not seek to exclude her. He was simply, consistently, there, in the way of a feature of the landscape, rather than a person choosing to occupy a room. On the fourth morning, she came down early and found him already in the hall, pulling on his riding coat. He looked at her and said, without greeting, "Do not go to the breakfast Lady Osgood has arranged for this morning. Send your apologies." Eleanor said, "I had no intention of going." A pause. Something moved in his eyes that might have been surprise. "Good," he said, and walked out. It was the longest conversation they had managed. She watched him cross the gravel from the morning-room window, his right hand bare against the cold, and thought about the parsonage kitchen at Ashwick and the kettle and Cowper's poems, and a man who had told her that his brother had been called Thomas, and that he had been the better horseman of the two. She had not asked what had happened to Thomas. He had not offered. She had understood at 17 that some subjects were complete in themselves, that naming a thing clearly was sometimes all a person could manage of it. She had wrapped the dressings and brought the tea, and read aloud when he asked, and said nothing when he did not ask. She had not thought of herself as doing anything of note. She had thought of herself as doing what the situation required, which was the only framework for action she had ever found reliable. He had left without knowing her name, she had thought then. He had never asked. Now she wondered if he had known it all along. The village of Deveridge lay a mile south of the estate, a small collection of stone buildings arranged around a green and a Norman church with a cracked finial. Eleanor had taken to walking there in the afternoons, partly because the mornings had been consumed by Lady Osgood's visits and Miss Hartworth's presence and the particular variety of isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who have decided not to see you, and partly because the village was real in a way the drawing room was not. She knew Agnes Cromwell by the 3rd week of her marriage. Agnes was the widow of a tenant on the Deveridge rolls, a woman of 50, with a bad knee and a determination that had outlasted 2 bad harvests, and a husband and a son who had gone to the war and not come back. She lived in one of the estate's south cottages, a low stone building with a garden that had been better tended when there were more hands to tend it. And when Eleanor first called, she had been in the kitchen, with her sleeves rolled, and a pot of something that smelled of onions and very little else on the range. She had looked at Eleanor with the particular assessment of a woman who has learned to distinguish between charity delivered from above and company arrived with its coat off. She had offered tea and asked no questions, and Eleanor had sat at the kitchen table and said nothing she had not meant. The steward, a man named Hartley, whose sympathies ran in the direction of his own convenience, had sent Agnes a notice in February regarding 4 months of rent in arrears, and the notice had sat on Agnes's kitchen table since then, because Agnes had no means to respond to it, and no one to ask. Eleanor read the notice at Agnes's kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. She read it twice. Then she put the coins she had brought for the market inside Agnes's mending basket, covered them with a bit of linen, and said nothing about it except that she would speak to the steward. She did not speak to the steward. She paid the arrears herself from the small quarterly sum her uncle had settled on her in the marriage agreement, counted it out in coin from the tin she kept in the bottom of her traveling case, and walked to Hartley's office on the Thursday morning and laid it on his desk and told him the matter was settled and that she expected no further notices to Agnes Cromwell. She was walking back through the south field when she became aware that she was being watched. She did not know how she knew it. The field was empty of people, or appeared to be, and the path was clear in both directions. She turned once, slowly, and saw nothing but the elm trees at the south fence line and the open sky above the pasture. She turned back and continued walking. He was there when she reached the gate, on the other side of it, his horse standing quiet at his shoulder, and his expression arranged in the same careful lines that it always kept. "You paid Agnes Cromwell's arrears," he said. It was not a question. "Hartley's notice was unreasonable," Eleanor said. "She has been a tenant here for 30 years. There are standards that ought to apply." He looked at her. It was the same quality of attention he had given her at the altar, the same sense of a man who saw things accurately and said so rarely. His right hand rested on the gatepost, the scar bright in the afternoon light. And he said nothing for a long moment. "Come inside," he said finally. "It is going to rain." She looked at the sky, which was clear in all directions. "It is not," she said. He opened the gate. She walked through it. If there was something in his face when he turned to close the gate behind her, something almost but not quite like the expression of a man who had heard an unexpected piece of music, she did not see it. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. The glove was only the first answer. There are others still to come. She did not find the portrait by intention. She had been looking for the library's east staircase, which Mrs. Peel had mentioned led to a gallery that housed the estate's older maps, and she had taken a wrong turning in the way of a person who was still learning a house that had 40 rooms and no wish to be learned quickly. She had come instead into the east corridor, a long, cold passage that received its light from a single north-facing window, and she had found herself standing before a framed canvas turned to face the wall. It was not unusual, in such a house, for paintings to be stored in corridors. This canvas had been hung. It was on its hook, facing in. She hesitated for a moment, and then, because she was a clergyman's daughter and had learned to think carefully before doing nothing, she lifted the edge of the frame and turned it. A young man looked back at her. He was perhaps 19 in the portrait, dressed in the informal style of the countryside, standing in what she recognized as the south field, with a horse at his shoulder and a quality of forward movement in his body that suggested he had been caught mid-arrival rather than posed. His hair was lighter than the Earl's, and his face was open in a way the Earl's face was not, the kind of openness that belongs to people who have not yet been asked to close. She set the frame back, carefully, the way she had found it. His name was Thomas. She did not startled easily. She turned. The Earl stood in the doorway of the east corridor, his right hand at his side, his face carrying nothing she could have named but which she recognized from Ashwick, from 4 Mornings in a Parsonage Kitchen, as the specific composure of a man who is managing something very large and very old. "I know," she said quietly. "You knew it then," he said. "You spoke of him twice in 4 days," she said. "I did not know the full shape of it. I knew there had been an accident and that you held yourself responsible." He was silent. The north window put gray light along the side of his face and left his eyes in shadow. "The horse shied," he said after a moment. "I had chosen it. I thought it was manageable. Thomas was the better rider. He always was." A pause. "He was not that day." She waited. "I wore the glove first because it embarrassed me," he said. "I was 20 years old and had lost my brother, and the scar was visible evidence of a decision I could not undo. By the time I stopped minding the embarrassment, I had worn it so long that removing it felt like a kind of declaration I was not prepared to make." He looked at her directly. "You were the first person in 14 years to ask." She thought about what it was to carry a thing that long. She thought about how you learn to hold something so steadily that the holding becomes invisible, even to yourself, and how the weight does not diminish. Only the visibility of the weight. "I brought something to the church," she said. She reached into the pocket of her gown, where her prayer book was, and from between its pages drew a small dried leaf, a beech leaf from the Ashwick garden, pressed 5 years ago, and kept without fully accounting for why. She looked at it for a moment. "I did not know why I brought it." He looked at the leaf. He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it in the way you hear a sound you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She put the leaf back between the pages of her prayer book. She closed the book. She met his gaze and held it. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have not been introduced properly." Something moved in his face. She thought it might have been the beginning of a very restrained smile, though it had not yet arrived fully. "No," he agreed. "We have not." They stood in the east corridor, in the gray light from the north window, and the house held its breath around them. She did not know, that afternoon, what form their proper introduction would take, or how long it would require, or whether the thing she felt in the vicinity of the east corridor's north window was something he felt as well. What she knew was that the scar was his, and the leaf was hers, and that 5 years ago, in a parsonage kitchen in Ashwick, They had already spoken to each other in the only register she had ever trusted, which was the register of what was actually true, rather than what was convenient to say. She did not know that Percy Osgood was already in the house. He arrived that evening, presented as a casual visitor, though his manner had the specific ease of someone who has come with a purpose and prefers that the purpose not be visible. He was personable in the way of men who have been told all their lives that they are personable, which is to say that his charm was perfectly finished and entirely without weight. He kissed his mother's cheek and made the drawing room ring with the sounds of a gathering that had produced a good evening. Eleanor sat by the fire and read and did not try to participate, because she had learned that Percy's version of inclusion was an instrument rather than a courtesy. He found her in the corridor before supper. "You have made yourself very comfortable here," he said pleasantly, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, in the attitude of a man who has all the time available to him. "I will say that, for a vicar's pauper, you have managed the situation rather well." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and moved to pass him. "I thought you might want to see something," Percy said, and held out a letter. She should not have taken it. She took it. It was in the Earl's hand, undated, addressed to a solicitor in London, and it outlined, in the precise legal phrasing of a man who understood both law and consequence, the conditions under which a marriage contracted under financial duress might be reviewed at the conclusion of the first year. It referenced the specific terms of Eleanor's uncle's agreement. It referenced the estate's need for stability. It did not reference Eleanor by name. She read it twice. "He never told you," Percy said. His voice was very kind, in the manner of kindness deployed as a cutting instrument. It was never meant to last beyond the season. The vicar's pauper was always just a convenient arrangement. We all knew it. She folded the letter. She held it in her hands for a moment, because her hands needed something to hold. Then she gave it back to him, because it was not hers, and she would not be responsible for it. She went to her room. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the Deveridge grounds in the dark, the pale gravel of the drive, the line of elms at the south boundary, the sky beginning to show its first stars. She did not cry, because the kind of grief she felt was the dry, contained kind that has no immediate outlet, the kind that settles into the body like cold and waits. She had known, she told herself. She had known from the February dinner, from Lady Osgood's voice in the dining room, from the mended hem and the borrowed silk. She had known that she was not expected to last. She had not known that she had begun to hope she might. Her prayer book was on the dressing table. She could see the small crease at the pages where the beech leaf lived, pressing its dry shape into the paper. She had carried it to her own wedding. She had not asked herself why. She asked herself now. And the answer arrived with the specific clarity of things that have been true for a long time. She had wanted it to be him. She had wanted, from the altar, for the scar to be the thing she remembered. She had wanted the glove to mean what she thought it meant. And she did not know, even now, whether it had meant what she thought or only what she needed. The letter had arrived at the solicitor's office in London in February. The Earl had written it before the February dinner, before the March ceremony, before the carriage ride and the morning room and Agnes Cromwell's arrears and the East Corridor and the beech leaf. The marriage had been a strategy, and she had been the piece. She sat by the window until the house was quiet, and then she sat a while longer, because there was nowhere else to sit. The invitation to the season's final assembly ball arrived on a Friday, addressed to the Earl and Countess of Deveridge, and Lady Osgood proposed at breakfast that they attend as a family party. Her voice was bright with the particular brightness of a woman who has arranged something and is pleased with the arrangement. Eleanor said she would attend. She had thought, in the days since Percy's corridor, that she would ask the Earl directly about the letter. She had considered the question in the mornings, and set it aside in the afternoons, and returned to it at night. And each time she returned she found the same difficulty, which was that she did not know what answer she was capable of believing. She had been told a thing that had a letter behind it, and letters did not misremember. She went to the ball in the gown she had altered herself, a deep cream silk that had been her mother's, refitted with new ribbon at the waist, and the sleeves pressed until they sat correctly. Mrs. Peel had pressed them, and had said nothing about the pressing, and that particular silence had cost Eleanor some effort not to receive. The assembly rooms in Deveridge Town were lit with 50 candles, and the heat of a season's worth of consequence arriving at once. The music was already in progress. Eleanor stood at the entry with the Earl's hand at her elbow, a formal proximity, and looked at the room, and the room looked back. Lady Osgood had arranged Miss Hartworth near the fireplace, which was the room's most visible point. Miss Hartworth stood in a gown of pale silver blue, and her smile was its most finished version. Percy was at his mother's shoulder, as always, his expression carrying the mild enjoyment of a man who has placed a wager and expects to collect. Lady Osgood moved through the gathering with her fan at its angle, and her voice at its calibrated pitch, and at the midpoint of the evening, she collected a small audience of 3 or 4 near the refreshment table, and her voice carried the way a voice does when its speaker has not concerned herself with whether it carries. "She has had her season," Lady Osgood said, with a warmth that was entirely a performance of warmth. "The vicar's pauper has her prize. One must allow for these temporary arrangements." A small sound of agreement or amusement, indistinct. "Poor Lavinia. These arrangements never last, you know." Eleanor was 8 feet away and heard it. She did not turn. She adjusted her glove at the wrist, which wanted no adjustment, and she looked at the candles above the mantelpiece and thought about nothing in particular. The Earl of Deveridge was beside her within the count of 3. She had not seen him come across the room. She had not seen him leave his conversation with a senior magistrate near the east window, or cross the floor at the pace a man adopts when he has made a decision, rather than when he is moving casually through a crowd. She only knew that he was there, and that his right hand, unscarfed, was at her back, and that he was looking at Lady Osgood with the specific quality of attention he usually reserved for legal documents. Lady Osgood saw him. Something in her face adjusted. He said, in a voice that was level and carried to exactly the distance it needed to carry, "My aunt is misinformed." The room, which had not quite been listening, became quite entirely listening. Percy said quickly, "Richard, this is not the place," and the Earl did not look at Percy. Lady Osgood said, "Deveridge, I was simply," and the Earl did not look at Lady Osgood either. He looked at Eleanor. She looked at him. His face, which had held its careful arrangement for so many weeks, had opened by some degree she could not have named, but which she recognized from a parsonage kitchen long ago as the face of a man who has stopped managing something and has simply permitted it to be true. He said, "For everyone present to hear, she is my wife, and she has always known me." Silence. Miss Hartworth looked at her own hands. Percy looked at his mother. Lady Osgood's fan stopped its motion, a very small arrest, and her face went through several stages of an expression she was not accustomed to wearing. Eleanor said nothing. She found she did not need to. The room had heard, and the room had understood, and the room was already performing the small recalibrations that gatherings perform when they have been shown that they were wrong. Later, When the music resumed and the floor filled again, and Lady Osgood had withdrawn to the refreshment table with a composure that required considerable work, Eleanor found herself near the east window, where the cold came through the frame in a thin, clean line. The Earl was beside her. "The letter," she said. "The one in February." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote that letter before I knew who you were," he said. "Percy showed it to me." "I know. Mrs. Peel informed me." A pause. "I wrote it because I knew what my aunt had arranged, and I believed that you would want the option to leave. I did not believe any woman of sense would choose to remain married to a man she had been given to settle a debt." His voice was level and precise, in the way of a man who has rehearsed the honest version and is now delivering it. "I had not met you. I did not know about Ashwick." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window. "When did you know?" she asked. "When did you know it was me?" He was quiet again, longer this time. "At the betrothal dinner," he said. "You reached for the bread, and I saw your hands, and I knew them." He paused. "I had been looking for a way to say so since February. I did not find one until you found it for me." Eleanor looked at the window. The glass held the dark outside, and returned the room's candlelight in a pale reflection. "I brought the leaf," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw it." She thought about a Tuesday morning, and a man who left on a hired horse, and a woman of 17 who watched from the parsonage gate and did not call after him, because calling after people was not the kind of thing she did. She thought about 5 years, and a tin of coins, and a letter, and a corridor, and the specific way a person holds something so long that the holding becomes as natural as breathing. "Richard," she said. He looked at her. "We should be introduced properly," she said. "I am Eleanor Bassett. I am the clergyman's daughter from Ashwick. I tended your hand in my father's kitchen, and I read to you from the 4th book of Cowper's Task, because you were feverish, and it was what I had. I kept a leaf from the garden, and I do not entirely know why, except that I think I always knew I would need it." His face, in the window's pale reflection and the room's warm candlelight, was the face of a man arriving somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward. "Richard Vane," he said quietly, "the Earl of Deveridge. I left Ashwick without knowing your name because I was 28 and a fool, and I have regretted it for 5 years." He reached out and took her hand in his right hand, the scarred one, the one he had carried covered for 14 years, and held it with a steadiness that was not distance but its precise opposite. "I am very glad you looked at my hand." They returned to Ashwick in the spring. It was not a long journey from Deveridge. 2 hours by carriage along roads that turned green in April, and Eleanor sat by the window and watched the familiar hedgerows appear, and felt the specific quality of recognition that belongs to places you left before you were ready. Mrs. Peel had packed a small hamper. The Earl had said nothing about the destination for the first hour, but his right hand rested on the seat between them, unhidden, and she had watched it without watching it, the way you watch a fire. The village of Ashwick was smaller than she had remembered, and exactly the size she had remembered, both of these things true simultaneously, as such places always are: the church with its square tower, the green, the lane that led to the old parsonage. The parsonage had a new incumbent, a young vicar who let them into the garden without question, perhaps because a countess in a cream traveling dress and an earl with a scar on his right hand carry a certain combined authority that makes question seem beside the point. The garden was the parsonage garden of April, which meant it was green-gray and damp, and the beech at the south wall was putting out its first small leaves, soft and pale-edged, and entirely new. Eleanor stood under the beech and looked up at it. She took the pressed leaf from her prayer book. It was dry and thin and shaped like a memory, and she held it in her palm for a moment and thought about a kitchen and a kettle and a man who had been in pain and had allowed her to help him. Which was, she understood now, the first costly thing he had ever done for her, though neither of them had known it at the time. She set the leaf at the base of the tree, in the soft earth, where the new roots were. Richard was watching her. She turned and found his eyes, gray as always, steady as always, holding something now that had not been there in February or March, but which she had begun to feel in the east corridor, and the assembly room, and the carriage this morning. A warmth in him that was new. The warmth of a man who has stopped keeping something at arm's length and has simply let himself look directly at it. He reached out his scarred hand. She took it. They stood in the parsonage garden in the April light, which was the thin, clean light of a season beginning, and the beech put out its new leaves above them. And the world went on exactly as it always had, which is to say that it went on, and they were in it together. And that was the thing that mattered. If Eleanor's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. It is the only record that these quiet acts of courage were witnessed.